to the Conservation Campus 125 on understanding and implementing the IUCN Protected Area Management categories. Thank you for agreeing to give up 4 hours of your life on this really fascinating subject. We're thrilled to see you here. It worked to go to the next slide. Okay, so there's 3 of us going to be running this conservation campus. Nigel Dudley, myself, and Peter Shady. A very brief introduction to the 3 of us. Nigel and I have been working on the categories for far too long, for about 10 years, from doing a review of the categories which led to a resolution at the Bangkok Conservation Congress to say that it was time that we revised the categories, revised categories that came out at the Barcelona World Conservation Congress. And then here we are again another 4 years later, taking that process further to talk about standards for assignment. Peter's involvement has been much more on the sharp end of things in trying to actually implement the standards around the world, particularly in Asia. And we've worked together quite a bit in Korea, which is where this picture was taken on implementing the categories. Now this picture was on a boat, and Peter was quite worried at the fact that the boat was kind of moving around in the sea a bit, and it made him look really short. So I promised that we would show this slide just to even things up a bit. So welcome from all of us to this campus. I particularly wanted to mention and thank the Korean Park Service. This picture is actually taken on Jeju, on Halasan, the mountain in the centre of the island. And I would really recommend, if any of you do have any spare time in this ridiculous circus of what is a congress, if you find time to go up it, it's a really beautiful mountain. Anyway, Peter and I were last here on Jeju 2 years ago. And we arrived a little early in the morning before our meeting, and we sat and had a cup of coffee and thought about what we wanted to do at the World Conservation Congress 2 years later. And we thought that running an event about assignment would be a good idea. So good ideas over a cup of coffee, here we are running the event. So, and with the support of the Korean Park Service. So for many reasons we're very grateful for the Park Service. So there's not so many of us in the room, and you get a little bit of knowledge about us. I wonder if we could just run very briefly around the room. I think we've got a mobile microphone somewhere. Someone can find the microphone. Oh, here we go. If you could just, given that we don't want to spend too long on this, maybe you could just give us your name and the institution that you're from. I would also ask that either in the centre of the table you leave your business cards, if you've got one with you, or if you haven't got a business card, if you could write on the sheet of paper your name, affiliation and email, just so that we've got an idea of all the people who are attending this campus. Okay.
I'm currently working for IUCN Regional Wildlife Conservation Program as a second year from Korean National Park Service.
Hello, my name is Marti Adela Sabana from Colombia. I am working with Natural Park.
I'm Eric Carrier from the Bahamas National Trust. Brent Mitchell with the Beck Labrador Foundation and the George Wright Society of the U.S.
Charles Israel, CEO, Israel National Park Authority.
Xavier from Institute of Nature Conservation in Ukraine.
Will Duckworth, Freelance Conservation Advisor.
Manok Bishaman from Thailand.
Andrej Solic, Slovenia and WCT.
Verona National Park Thailand, Australia.
Vladimir Queensland, Australia.
Jose Pro, IUCN Regional Office for West America and Finland.
Hi, I'm Yogi Lee from Korea Police Service.
Hi, my name is Zhao Yongchan from Korea Forest Service. I do research in Korea National Laboratory.
Hello, I'm Nigel Dudley. I'm one of the other organisers that we're talking about.
Hello, my name is Stana Kulonen. I come from Finland, from the Finnish Park Service Technology.
Thomas Olsson from the Europark Federation.
Hi, my name is Yogini Damodar. I work for the Conservation Trust of Puerto Rico and the NGO.
Hi, I'm Christian Fischer, working for the Secretariat of the Pacific Regional Environment Program in San Juan.
Good afternoon, John Day, the Great Barrier Reef Park Authority in Australia.
Dan Foley, Green Vice Chair of the World Commission.
Roger Cross, UK, WCPA Europe.
Hi, Chris Bland from the IUCN National Committee for the UK, also helping apply the categories in the
I'm Bob Pierco from Canada. I'm a member of the WCPA.
I'm Philip Given, University of Victoria, Canada.
I'm Kate Body, I'm Royal University in Canada. Sky Augustine, Graduate University of Victoria, Canada.
I'm Pete Shetty. I was the tall one on the
Thanks everybody, and we've got a nice mix of people from all over the world, and as I say, please can you make sure that you either leave your business card on the little table or that you write your name, affiliation and email, because we'd love to keep contact with you and know who is here. So I'm just going to very briefly run over the programme for this afternoon's campus and then pass over to Nigel who'll talk a little bit more about the categories. So the objectives of this campus are very much to review the 2008 IUCN System of Management Categories for Protected Areas. We particularly want to discuss the implementation of the guidelines since 2008. We've got some new supplementary guidance on marine protected areas which we'll be talking about, the guidance and governance assessment which is forthcoming, and we're going to hear a little bit about some ongoing assignment projects from around the world. And really the idea of building up this knowledge is to then spend some time reviewing the implementation experience and advice, and this is particularly to contribute to the development of a project that we're working on to develop some additional guidance on assigning and reporting of the categories. So the agenda, we've started with a little getting to know you session. Then Nigel will give a short introduction of the categories and just a brief introduction to some recent innovations, and then run a question and answer session. Peter will then go on to introduce the category assignment project that we're working on, and we have 3 presentations from Europe, from South Korea and from Central America on recent experiences with assigning the categories. Then we take a break for some tea, or some of you might want coffee, I suppose, for the tea break. And then after the tea break, which will be half an hour, Nigel will chair a panel session where we can explore again in a bit more detail the challenges and the lessons learned from using the categories. After that, in the sort of final hour of the campus, we want to break out into 3 small round tables looking at applying the categories in Europe. Now we chose that specifically because there's quite a few people here from Europe who are either in the process of or about to start projects on assigning the categories. We are going to call on the expertise we have here with Dan and John to look at the new supplementary guidelines on marine protected areas, and then a more general session for anybody else looking at assigning and using the categories. We'd like to know, and maybe just before the tea break, which ones of those round tables that you're interested in taking part in. And I'm aware that some of you might want to take part in a couple of those, in which case we can kind of arrange them so we split them into halves. So before the tea break, if you could just think a little bit about which areas you'd like a bit more expertise in. And then we'll close the day with a short wrap-up and a next step session. I'm also aware, obviously, that we're running this campus in English. Obviously, not everybody here has English as a first language, so please, if we're going too fast, or there's any points that you would like to make, just say if you're not finding it clear enough or understanding, please let us know. We'll slow down, or we can explain points more clearly. So do let us know, just put your hand up. So okay, on that, I'm going to pass over to Nigel, who's going to talk about the categories in more detail. And I'll go and get more help.
Thank you. Where did you load those?
I'm doing it down here.
Oh, right, okay. Fantastic. Good afternoon. I'm going to talk for about 20 minutes and then have a sort of 10-minute question and answer session just to clarify any points, but most of the discussion will take place later in the afternoon. Many of you know the background, in which case, apologies, some people don't, so we're going to very quickly run through a little bit of history and then the current status of the definition and categories. This process goes back to 1975 when IUCN began to develop a category system, at that stage purely as a way of managing this growing body of statistics about national parks and protected areas. And the first guidelines to the categories, they went through a number of stages. At one stage there were 12 or 13, they went down to 5, settled on about 6 categories, management categories, was published in 1994. Since 2004, parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity have been encouraged to use the categories as part of their reporting against the CBD's Programme of Work on Protected Areas. In the early 2000s, IUCN also recognised that the categories were being used in a number of ways that weren't originally planned for, and commissioned a number of people, including Sue and I, and including Adrian Phillips, who many of you know or know by name, to do a review of how the categories had been used, which was published in 2004. At that stage, it was also recognised that what had begun as a statistical tool had begun to influence things like planning, management, policy, laws, to some extent even the underlying philosophy of protected areas. And had also been abused to a certain extent, in that categories, putting an area of land under a certain category was being used as a reason, in some cases, to expel people from the land because it was a high category protected area, was being used in ways that IUCN neither agreed with nor expected. So there was recognition and agreement at the 2004 World Conservation Congress that we needed to go back and revisit the categories. At the same time, there was a fair bit of criticism about some of the categories, particularly the less strictly protected categories, and long debate about what the then current definition of a protected area meant, particularly with respect to the primacy of nature conservation within within a protected area. And there was a split within IUCN, there was a fair amount of criticism from outside, and there was an influential paper published by Harvey Locke and Phil Dearden, and Phil's here this afternoon so he can comment on that later, which said at the time that although Category 5 and Category 6 protected areas, the less strictly protected areas, were very important from a cultural and recreational point of view, they were not doing a good job for nature conservation and shouldn't be recognised as protected areas. And so there was a whole mess of different debates and different tensions and different opinions within the broader union of IUCN and within protected area agencies. So at that stage it was decided to review the categories. There was a long process, a 4-year process, with a lot of debate, meetings around the world, a big summit meeting in Almeria in Spain, funded by the Andalusian government, in the days when Spain still had money, and but also meetings in most of the continents, and lots of individual meetings. There were over 40 papers published building up to the new guidelines. There was an e-debate, there was a whole series of discussions, and well over 1,000 people took part in those debates one way or another. And out of that, in 2008, new guidelines were published at the World Conservation Congress in Barcelona. These have been used in the years since. Guidelines have 3 main elements. They they provide a definition of protected area, which changed from the 1994 definition. This was something that we didn't expect. I certainly didn't expect. It was a complete pain in the neck. It took a lot of time, but was quite interesting. It brought the debate very much to centre stage. A definition of 6 management categories, and also for the first time a definition of 4 governance types, plus a lot of guidance on the way those might be used. So the new definition, a clearly defined geographical space, recognised, dedicated and managed through legal or other effective means to achieve the long-term conservation of nature with associated ecosystem services and cultural values. A number of important things I'd like to pull out there. This is, first of all, it's legal or other effective means. That means it's not only state areas. This was very explicitly opening the definition of protected areas to include community conserved areas, indigenous lands. That had been implicit before, but it was much more strongly stated. Long-term conservation of nature given primacy for the first time, which wasn't clear in the last definition. But what had previously been called biological diversity, the old definition, was broadened to conservation of nature, so it brought in things like geodiversity and some landscape values. So it was a slightly broader definition, but raised to a higher level. Also explicit recognition of ecosystem services and cultural values. And then the other important change I'd like to emphasise is that it says achieve. The last definition very clearly did not include management effectiveness or the effectiveness of the area within the definition, in part to avoid the risk of countries losing effectiveness for a while and then losing the protected area. People being able to argue that if it wasn't being managed effectively, it was no longer a protected area. But partly as a result of pressure from protected area managers themselves, who wanted some element of management effectiveness within the definition, that's been included. So it very clearly reflects geological diversity, increases the emphasis of nature conservation, and the guideline takes that one sentence definition and explains it word by word, phrase by phrase, with explanation and glossary, which again hadn't been done, and I think that's one of the things that had caused confusion in 1994. There are also a number of principles. The key one I want to mention here is that for IUCN, only those sites where the main goal or outcome is conserving nature should be considered protected areas. This does not exclude sites with other goals at the same level, such as cultural or spiritual, but in the case of conflict, nature conservation has to be the priority. So clearly, if a site has sacred values for a people, they're never going to say nature conservation is more important than the gods they worship or the cultural values they have. But if they call it a protected area, management of those values should not undermine conservation. And you can see that tension in Korea, for example, where most of the national parks have Buddhist temples within them, and there is tension between what the Buddhists would like to do with the land and what the nature conservation would like to do. You see that in many, many parts of the world, but the principle is that in the case of conflict, nature conservation has to be a priority if the area is a protected area. There are also 6 management categories. They didn't change from 2008, but the guidance associated with them was clarified and to some extent changed. I'll go through very quickly. Important note, the names that a site is given are not necessarily reflecting on the management process, particularly the case in National Park, which is used in different parts of the world in very different ways. Sue and I live in the Snowdonia National Park, which is a cultural Category 5 managed area, protected landscape with settled communities, with cultural management. That's nowhere applicable, equivalent to a Category 2 protected area like Serengeti National Park. So names are not so important. I'll really flash through these very quickly, I think you know them. Category 1A, strict nature reserve, set aside